When they asked me to be part of the sleep study, I thought it would be an odd little story to tell at parties. I once slept in an abandoned asylum, I'd say, and people would smile with a nervous edge and ask, "Did anything weird happen?" I didn't tell them then that I was gambling on weirdness, that I wanted to wake with something true clinging to my teeth. The experiment promised clean science, a week in the facility where the researchers would monitor REM cycles, measure brain waves, log dreams. No suggestion of ghosts, no woo. The walls were concrete and kind of nostalgic in their peeling paint. The lab set up a mattress in a room that had once been doctor housing. They taped sensors to my temples and called it electrode placement like it was as harmless as putting a hat on. The first night I dreamt of corridors that did not exist in the building's blueprint. They wound like the insides of shells, all one way. In the dream, people sat at tables with outlines in their faces, talking about appointments that had already been cancelled. When I woke, the researchers were scanning my readings and asking if I felt rested. I said yes, which was a lie indeed. After the second night, my dreams began to borrow specifics from the asylum's past. A child with a bowl haircut and an old doll in its lap that smelled like mothballs. A nurse with hands as steady as a clock. A doctor who put stamps in patient files and called them notes. I started keeping a dream journal at their request, but the entries looked like case studies. Patient in blue resists sleep, urges, compel, intervention, none. On the fourth night, I woke with a wristband around my arm. It was not mine. It had a patient name stamped into the plastic and the faint, almost unnoticeable embossing of a hospital name. County Insane Asylum. Patient 3729. I laughed. The researchers smiled and chalked it up to confabulation. Sleep studies can produce false memories, they said, like they were giving polite advice. I started to notice small details on my person, a faint smear of iodine on the back of my neck, an imprint of a hospital pillow crease on my cheek. When I reached my pocket, I found a folded paper chart labeled Dr. Lawson Notes, my name printed in a steady hand. It took days before I realized the chart wasn't a prop. The handwriting was my own. The notes described people I had no memory of meeting and incidents I had never experienced. One entry read, "Patient experienced vivid recall of electroconvulsive therapy. Requested solace. Recommend overnight restraint." Another underlined in a single word, "Repeat." Night after night, the dreams grew more organized. They stopped being random pantomimes of fear and became sequences. A patient wakes, a nurse visits, a doctor observes, a note is entered. When I woke, the same sequence had been added to my own memory like a stamp. I would remember the doctor watching, the clinic gown rustling, my fingers pressed to a chart. I would, absurdly, remember the warm snap of a pen on paper. One morning, I woke to find myself wearing a lab coat with my name stitched into the breast. Dr. E. Lawson. I had no memory of putting it on. The lab coat smelled faintly of antiseptic and old fields. When I flipped open the chest pocket, there was a key and a small metal badge. Staff, night shift. I tried to leave. The exit doors were locked, but the researchers assured me it was a safety protocol. We want to control variables, they said, but control is a neat, arrogant word. It hides the fact that something larger can still move around your measurements, like a rat behind a wall. As the study continued, The boundary between dream and waking narrowed. I would dream of writing a prescription and wake to find that same handwriting on the chart beside my bed. The patients in my dreams began to recognize me, not like neighbors, but like someone whose face they had been waiting for. A woman with hair like faded rope would smile and reach for my hand with the familiarity of someone reclaiming something lost. A boy would call me by my name, Doc, or something else. Sometimes they would hand me items, a spoon with the initials EL scratched into the handle, a ring, a photograph of a young man who might have been a stranger. The most disorienting thing was that the asylum remembered as well. The building kept offering up details it shouldn't. One night, I dreamed of an operation that had never been performed in my lifetime. The surgeon's coat had a patch with the date 1962. In the dream, the surgeon turned and said, "You left the light on." When I woke, a light was indeed on the room. There was a lamp that could not normally be switched from the bed. On the last night of the study, the dream did not end with me waking. In it, I stood in a small lecture room before a half-filled audience of staff and patients. On the table beside me was a projector, and the slide it showed was a photograph, a portrait of a doctor in a white coat, smiling in the way of someone proud of a ward. It was me, only younger by decades, and behind me was a row of faces that blurred into specters. The audience clapped, and I felt something like disgust and longing swell in my chest. A man in the front row, now a patient in my dream, then impossibly both, stood and said, "Do you remember?" The man had my hands. "You always forget," he said. "That's why we brought you back." When I opened my eyes for the final time, a nurse, not one of the researchers, stood at the foot of my bed holding my chart. The chart was thick with notes in my handwriting. The nurse looked at me the way a veterinarian looks at an animal it has bonded with during treatment. "Dr. Lawson," she said, "you slept well. Your REM cycle is stable." "I'm not a doctor," I said. The words were small. The nurse smiled not unkindly. "You will be again." There was an object on the chart, a pair of keys and a patient wristband that read the same number I had seen in my dreams. Attached to it by a safety pin was a photograph. In it, I saw a face I recognized as my own, and a date burned into the corner, 11/09/1955. Underneath, in ink, I could feel like an itch. Someone had scrawled, "Returned to duty." Panic is a curious thing. It scatters you like papers in wind. I tore through the researchers' files and found archival photographs labeled with names I recognized from my dreams. In one, a doctor in a white coat stood before a ward, his hair dark and earnest. The caption read, "Ephraim Lawson, Chief Psychiatrist, 1950 to 1955. Under that, in smaller print, "Disappearance, unresolved." I kept thinking that discovery would free me, that the moment I pinned a fact to the board would be the moment the spell shattered. It did not. Instead, the dream became a net. The asylum dreamed a life back into me with such patience that I found myself adopting the mannerisms of a man I'd never been. I straightened my shoulders in the mirror until my reflection looked like someone else's photograph. On the last morning, before the researchers finally opened the doors and the light poured in like a verdict, I sat at what had been a nurse's station and opened the file labeled with my own name. The notes were clinical. Patient returned to role after extended absence. Reorientation recommended. A scrolled slip of paper fell out and landed at my feet. On it were instructions. Shift begins at dusk. Do not discuss. Exit. The dream is protocol. I remember two things about leaving. One, The researchers shook my hand and said something about follow ups and a lovely data set. 2. I did not leave with the researchers. I left with the keys in my pocket and the badge on my lapel. The doors clicked shut behind me, but I had the sense that they had always been opened for someone like me. Now, in my own apartment, I wake and reach for charts. Dreams come uninvited as phone calls. Sometimes I wake to find a pen in my hand and my handwriting on the nearest scrap of paper. Once, in the shower, I began to recount the notes for a patient I have never met. The worst part is not that the asylum reintroduced me to a life that may have been mine. The worst part is that in my bones I understand the kindness that the asylum practiced. I understand why the staff would rather make someone into a doctor than let them rot in oblivion. I understand why the building would dream back a caregiver rather than risk silence. Last week, a woman knocked on my door and said she'd been looking for a Dr. Lawson. Her eyes were soft with the need of someone asking to be named. She asked if I could help her mother, who had been reading the same sentence over and over. I put on my old coat because it was there, and the badge had the weight of a promise. And I realized that the asylum had taught me a different kind of terror, the terror of doing the right thing for the wrong reason. Sometimes, in the quiet, I close my eyes and try to remember what it was like before the dreams came back. I can't. Memory is a sticky thing. The asylum stitched itself into me with stitches I cannot see. Each one a whispered reminder, you belonged here before. Sometimes I hear the building in my sleep, calling me by a name I once wore with the certainty of a uniform. I answer because that's what you do when a house calls you home. If you ever find yourself in a room that remembers you more than you remember it, be careful what you let it teach you. Buildings that dream will always prefer the living to the dead. They will wake you, my friend, stitch you back together, and hand you a badge. They will ask you to stay because it is better to have someone who remembers than to be forgotten entirely. Tonight, when I close my eyes, I do not always know whether I am going to sleep or starting my shift again. They say the basement of the old Harrow Asylum smelled of rot and old paper, but I didn't notice that first night. I was focused on the recorder, a hand-cranked thing I found wedged behind a filing cabinet. Its leather strap cracked like an old smile. It fit in my palm like a promise. I thought stupidly that if I recorded something, put a voice to the building, the asylum would obey me. Name the ghost and it will show itself. That is how it works, right? Tell a story and the place will follow. I turned it on. The wheel clicked like a heartbeat. For the first minute there was only the hiss and me and the scrape of my own breath. Then a voice came through the static. Soft, patient, male, calm. You are here because you remember being here, it said. I froze. The voice was mine. It wasn't some uncanny impression. It was my exact timbre. My laugh tucked into the consonants, my stupid habit of dropping the ends of words. I clicked the crank faster until the wheel stuttered. The voice continued, as if it had been waiting on an empty stage. You always come back to the tape, don't you? It said. You think you are finding us, but we found you a long time ago. The first tape said my name, not just the name I use now, but the name on my birth certificate. It told me I would climb the iron stairs to the west wing. It described the exact sound of the light switch I was going to flick the next morning. I laughed, and because the universe is terrible at irony, the laugh was recorded onto the second reel, right after the sentence, "You will laugh." Over the next week, I found more tapes. They were stacked in the same low shelf, each labeled in a hand that looked like mine from the future. 1, 2, 3. The more I listened, the more they stopped being predictions and started being instructions. The voice guided me across rooms, through the asylum's failing plumbing, told me where to pry the loose floorboard and where to stand to hear the walls breathe. At night, the corridors echoed with the same phrases I just heard on the tapes. I stopped being surprised. On the fourth tape, there was a pause. I thought it was a blank. Then the voice spoke in a whisper that didn't belong to me at all. "They are watching the recorder," it said. "They take the last recording. They'll leave one for you." The next day, I found the tape recorder in the laundry room, clean as a newly washed bone. The wheel was warm. Something had used it in the night. I tried leaving. I did, but the tapes didn't let me. The recording files were precise in their cruelty. Leave at noon, get to the bus stop, call your sister. They wrote grief into small, manageable steps, like surgical instructions. When I obeyed, I woke to new tapes. When I disobeyed, the tapes described my disobedience and slowed. The tick of the wheel turned into counting down. The voice never raised its volume, it just tightened. One tape told me about an accident that would happen in the courtyard. It said I would bend to pick up a paper and a shard of glass would bite my palm. I almost laughed, and then I bled, exactly where the tape said. The cut was small and clean. I have never been lucky with coincidence, but at that point, coincidence felt like a machine. By the time I realized what was happening, my life had been reduced to listening and following and recording. I started carrying my own recorder, a modern black box that ate batteries like candy. Each night I would leave the asylum with fresh reels in my pocket, and each morning another tape would be waiting. Sometimes there would be a gap, 3 hours described as silent. Once the voice spoke of a stair that led nowhere and a man who walked down it for years until his knees gave out. The man wore my jacket. The twist, the small, hard, impossible thing, arrived in a drawer marked palm trials beneath a stack of treatment notes. There, between patient intake forms, I found a thin, soft folder with my handwriting on the cover. Inside, dates. Dates that had not happened yet, places I hadn't been, a death certificate with my name and a date a year from now. I stared until my eyes ached. The last line, the last neat clinical line read, "Last patient on record, my name, cause of death, self-fulfilling memory." When I turned the recorder on that night, I hoped the voice would be different. I wanted anything but me. It answered, as it always did, from inside my throat. "You don't understand how this works, right?" It said. "You think the tape predicts. It doesn't. It records potential and pulls at it like a puppet. Tape records, people remember, and remembering becomes true." "Who are they?" I asked. The hiss filled the room, a distant clink like a cage closing. "Not they," the voice said. We who are kept in loops, we who listen. You know this voice because you were once the one who recorded it." I should have thrown the recorder away then. I did not. Instead, I spent nights rifling through the files for any clue to stop it. In an old ledger, I found a list of names, staff, doctors, patients, each crossed out except one. A name at the bottom had been circled until the ink bled. The founder of Harrow, Dr. Lennox Harrow. Underneath his name, someone had scrawled in a shaky, almost childlike hand, "Tapes learn faces." Finally, a tape arrived that told me how to stop being remembered. "Destroy the reel that holds the old voice," it said. "Burn it until it sings no more." I did what any reasonable person possessed by stubbornness would do. I came armed with a lighter and a prayer. I found the reel in the chapel, tucked behind a pile of hymnals. It was heavy and smelled of sulfur and rotten paper. When I struck a match and set the edge alight, the film warmed and then sang like a throat being cut. The voice in my head screamed, and the tapes on my other recorder rewound themselves as if hands were turning the wheels. For a second, the building was silent, pure, raw, terrifying silence. Then the recorder in my pocket clicked and recorded a new voice, one I did not know and could not imitate. It said only, "New copy, new voice, same field." I understood then that destroying one voice only opened space for another. The tapes wanted a mouth to live in. They didn't just predict, they recruited. They used the living to stay alive. In this case, they were using me. An hour later, I was in the basement again. Because of course I was. That's the thing about memory. It is greedy. It finds the thinnest places in a person and pushes. I heard the wheel click. The recorder I had carried was writing on its own. What would happen next? The voice it produced was softer now, like a lover coaxing you under. It told me I was tired. It told me I could rest. It told me that the recording would save me from being recorded. The final line it recorded, the line I still hear when I turn the lights off, was not a prediction. It was an invitation. Record this, it said. Tell them what you did. Make sure they listen. Make sure they remember you. I put the recorder to my mouth and began speaking, because that's what it wanted. I told the story of the tape that taught me my future. My voice trembled in the reel and then sat still like dark water. I told them about Harrow and the wheel and the way memory wants company. When I finished, the recorder vibrated as if swallowing. You can hear me now. Somewhere down the corridor, there is a tape with my voice on it. And if you go to Harrow and dig through the dust, you will find it. You will press play. You will hear the way my vowels drop and the way I curse the ceiling fan. You will listen and you will learn. Then you will obey, and then you will make the next tape. I am, for now, still breathing. I do not know how long that will last. The folder with my death certificate sits on the table across from me, neat as an obituary written ahead of time. If you want to help, the tape told me you can burn the recorder, but the tape also told me that if you burn the recorder, you will remember burning it. Memory is the trickster here. It makes sacrifice into ritual. It turns attempt into triumph. If you found Harrow because of me, because of this recording you are listening to, you are already involved, my friend. The wheel is turning. The basement is warm. The tapes want voices. I can teach you to listen. I can teach you to speak. Or I can teach you to stop. But I have learned one thing in the echoing rooms of Harrow. The last patient is never alone. They make more. When they demolished the new wing, the city council left the old records in a blue bin by the doors, like unwanted children. I was cataloging donations for the Historical Society, or that's what I told myself. In truth, I liked being alone there at night. It made my breathing the loudest thing in the building. The asylum, Greystone, was a strip of shadow against the sky, windows like blank eyes. I told myself I was cataloging because the nights made me brave. The first time I saw her, she was on the other side of a corridor, stepping out of frame like someone coming off a stage. The uniform was wrong for this century. A fitted wool dress, caps starched to a precise angle, leather shoes that had once shone. She moved with a deliberate small economy, tending with her hands as if to a patient I could not see. When our eyes met, she nodded and kept walking. I followed. She moved with authority, the way a person who belongs somewhere does. She paused at a door labeled Room 19 and pushed it open like an apology. Inside, the curtains were intact, threadbare but white. A cot sat in the center, a rusted tray at its foot. The nurse adjusted an unseen blanket, smoothed wrinkles that weren't there, spoke in a voice that did not belong to the building. "You are late for your treatment," she said. I told myself at the time that I mistook the look of care for something sinister. I told myself I was being melodramatic. I told myself many things to stop my teeth from chattering. Instead, I stepped forward until I stood in the doorway. She turned to me with the gentleness of someone kneading dough and offered me a syringe. I'm not a patient, I said. Words like a child's denial. They sounded thin. You were scheduled, she replied. Her tone was not accusatory, it was factual, like weather. I backed away and the door clicked. I slept in my car that night. The next morning, a note sat on my desk, folded into a small square like a secret. Inside, in looping blue ink, return at dusk. Room 19 will not close itself. Curiosity is a habit that wears fine gloves, I returned. This time, when the nurse handed me a syringe, it was filled with something that looked like water and melted glass. Her hands were steady, practiced. Her eyes were a flat, perfect gray, the color of a person who could not cry. Tell me, she said, and the syringe was poised like an eyebrow. Do you remember when you wore the shoes? The question hit me like a palm. I did remember shoes, but not shoes I owned. I remembered the weight of leather over feet that had nursed, that had led men to rooms with locks, that had recorded names in a ledger. I remembered a ledger in a handwriting I now recognized, my own. Decades truer. I wanted to laugh and call that memory wrong, a cobweb of some late night. Instead, I found myself telling the story, like confession. I had in my youth worked in hospitals. I had been on the care side of things. I had been once a nurse. I recited internships and a name that sounded like an echo of itself. The nurse nodded, as if validating a report. You were good, she said. You were made to be good. Then she told me about room 19. It was the room for those who could not keep their secrets, she said. It was the room where staff learned humility. She said it with a sweetness that tasted like antimony. The needle hovered. I thought about the way people used to talk about hospitals, that the staff had to be clinical because otherwise the grief would eat them, that they had to close the door and become quiet people with steady hands. Do you want to help? She asked. And because my throat had become a hallway for inevitability, I said yes. I remember the night in sharper detail now. My hands were smaller. The tray sat cool on the bed. The syringe slid into my palm as if we were completing a ritual I had signed up for in a life I could not recall. I tried not to think about the faces on the walls, the way the plaster had the faint impression of 100 palms glued there from 1,000 years of kneading and pleading. The first injection, I was told, was benign, a sedative for a patient with nightmares. The patient, a man with eyes like dried fruit, slept and breathed like someone who had been taught not to. After the injection, the man smiled and said, "Thank you." I felt like a traitor and a savior all at once. The nurse took my hand and held it as if it were the end of a funeral program. Over the weeks, I returned like a pilgrim. The nurse would give me a simple task: administer, record, watch. I would write the names down in my ledger. The names changed, but the loop did not. Each time, I felt the old anxiety of being responsible, the wrong dosage, the missed sign, the eye that shouldn't close. I told myself I was doing good. But that's the thing about rooms like room 19. They teach you patterns, they teach you obedience, they teach you how to become the instrument of the asylum. Under the nurse's patient instruction, I began to forget that I had once been someone outside these walls. My life sharpened into neat lines of a schedule. One night, I found my ledger open to a page I didn't recognize. My handwriting filled the paper in the same steady loops, except the dates were wrong. They read like invitations. November 14th, 1962. Treatment administered. November 28th, 1962. Staff curfew missed. December the 9th, 1962, resignation denied. I burned that sheet because fire feels like an answer to everything. The nurse brought me tea the next morning and told me she liked the smell of gas. She said it as one would note the weather. I tried to leave once. I ran toward the west exit, heart stuttering like an unpaid metronome. And when I reached the doors, I found my shoes missing. They were on the other side, laced and polished, waiting. The nurse stood by them as if placed like there was a landmark. You always forget the things you should take with you, she said. I started to see other nurses in the corridors then, hunched and turning like faces in a faded photograph. Sometimes they'd be in the windows, tending to ghosts as if arranging plants in a greenhouse. Sometimes they would pass me silently, hands folded, and I would hear them counting names, amounts, times, like rosary beads. It took me longer than it should have to notice that the nurse's uniform never changed and the cap stayed starched no matter the humidity. It took me longer to notice that in the old ledger, the names of the nurses, including my own in slanted script, dated decades before I'd been born. The break came on a stormy night when the generator clattered and the lights burned like eyes. I walked the corridor because the building had begun to whisper. The nurse was at the end of the hall, speaking to the door of room 19, a voice like someone reading scripture. When she turned for the first time, I saw beneath her sleeves the faint lines of scars. They trailed up the forearm like map lines, like the record of a life lived with instruments instead of hugs. Why do we do this? I asked. The words slid out like someone testing speech after a long silence. She smiled. For them, she said, for the ones who stay. For who? I asked. But that question had been asked. The nurse's eyes darkened. The gray deepened like a storm in a teacup. For the ones who will not remember being loved unless someone else remembers for them, she said. We record, we contain. We are the hands that repeat kindness until kindness becomes fact. I wanted to believe, I wanted to be noble, so I listened. And on the table, under a pile of starched linens, I found an old photograph. It was a group portrait of staff. Men with trembling mustaches and women with stiff caps. In the front row, a woman in a nurse's uniform held the hand of a child with my face. I knew then that memory at Greystone did not come by accident. It was curated. The last thing the nurse ever said to me before daylight savings stole an hour from the calendar and before the building blinked out like a tired animal was, "You can either give the treatment or be the one who gets it." Her hand closed around my wrist, and I felt the cold bite of a name I had not yet spoken. She placed in my palm a syringe and a list. On the top of the list, in my handwriting, as steady as a trained hand, were the words, "Nurse, room 19, start date, tonight." I could refuse. I tried to. I ran to the door and pulled the handle, and it turned like a hinge greased long ago. I could have jumped into the mud and never come back. Instead, I found myself slipping into the uniform, buttoning it with fingers that remembered, the cap tucked into place like a crowning. I tell the story now because the ledger sits somewhere in a box in the Historical Society's archive, and because room 19 is still there and because the nurse still walks the corridors on stormy nights. If you go to Greystone and you hear someone whispering from behind closed doors, remember this. Sometimes the people who care for the broken are themselves the ones who are broken, and they need hands to continue the care. I am the nurse now. The syringe sits in my drawer, the ledger is open, and the dates are being written as I breathe. Occasionally, I look up from the records and wonder if somewhere outside someone is cataloging the lost, and whether if they found me in those pictures, they'd recognize the face as my own or someone else's. Tonight, a knock comes at the door. Room 19 will not close itself.